going to go ahead and get started here. First of all, thanks to all of you for joining us today. I'm Heather Noonan, the Vice President for Advocacy with the League for American Orchestras. And this session is called Changing the System, a Strategic Approach to Making a Difference. And we're going to spend some time here very briefly introducing the three speakers who have joined us here today. And then we'd very much like the bulk of this session to be a conversation. And hopefully a conversation that you'll walk out of the room with some real new ideas and some tools that you can take back home to really imagine how to shift from what might feel like episodic or annual or historic programmatic work into something that's more systemic, something that really takes into consideration what your community most values from your organization, where your community is in terms of its civic priorities, and what the opportunities are for your organization to address those priorities, deliver value, and do it in a way that has some continuity and some depth. So first, we're going to hear from Elizabeth Merritt, who is with the American Association of Museums. I have to confess, at the League of American Orchestras, we are always keeping our eye on AAM. They're usually thinking just a couple steps ahead on trends in the cultural community. And Elizabeth is actually the best example of that, I think, within her organization, because she runs a program called the Center for the Future of Museums. So we've got a futurist among us who can share some examples of what she's observing from our cultural partners in the museum community. Next, we'll hear from Gigi Antoni, who's with Big Thought, located right here in Dallas. Gigi's work and the work of her organization is very much steeped in community partnerships and systemic change. And it's not just a model of what's been effective here in Dallas, but the work that Big Thought undertakes is emulated nationally in a lot of other communities. And just recently, she was named by the White House as a champion of change. So when we think about being systemic and making change, Gigi's a perfect person to hear from. And I hope most of you already know our third speaker, Dalouge Smith, with the San Diego Youth Symphony. Luke has really been a leader for us in thinking about depth of engagement at the community level. He's served in various leadership capacities with us at the League, and I think has a really compelling story to tell about how to connect with community on the front end of reconsidering your programmatic work. So with those introductions, I'm going to begin by handing it off to Elizabeth.
Thank you, Heather. And I'm going to begin by just giving you a lightning introduction to where I'm coming from so you know what you can plumb my brain about when we go into the discussion portion. Okay, this is your iconic museum. Big iconic building with big ionic columns. And when you go inside, you know that you're going to be told not to touch anything. You're going to be told not to take photographs of anything. And you're going to read a little label that tells you who the artist was, when he painted this, what the title is, and what the medium was, in case you know what gouache is. I never figured it out. And for 100 years, this worked just fine, right? So why change the model? Well, the reason that we're having to deal with change in the future, first of all, is even if this is your iconic museum, we're really a very diverse field. There's something around, and I say something around because we haven't got a good count, about 37,000 organizations in the US that we would call a museum. Because when AAM says museum, we mean everything from an art museum like this, to a zoo, to a botanical garden, to a children's museum, to a science center, to a nature center. And when you look at all of those kinds of organizations, they're incredibly diverse, but they share certain challenges. And one of the challenges they share is they are living in an incredibly rapidly changing world, hence the Center for the Future of Museums. Because when we look at, for example, the social situation in which we exist. Right now, the demographics of the US are changing radically. By 2040, we're going to be a majority-minority country. There already are whole states in the US that are majority-minority. Museums' core audience is still 10% minority, 90% Caucasian, white, and affluent. If that disparity continues, if that gap continues to grow, who's going to be coming to museums? Technology. This little device has changed everybody's expectation of how they behave in museums, about what they want to do in museums, about how they connect with their friends, about how they share information. It's a game changer. Economic. Traditionally, even though it's been eroding over the past 10 years, 20% on average of the income from museums came from state, local support, a little bit of federal money in that 20%. That's collapsing now. The cities and the states don't have the tax dollars to devote to museums, and every other single source of income, whether it's earned income from tickets, whether it's draw on the endowment, whether it's foundation support, it's all under threat. Where's the new money going to come from? Even the ecology. Museums are living in regions that are threatened by rising tides, rising sea levels, threatened by increasing rates of fire from drought, living in communities that are trying to grow while they're limited by water because they're exceeding their capacity. So museums are dealing with ecological threats as well. And last of all, we're all dealing with political threats. I don't know if you read the commentary on the latest proposed budget that came out of the House, but the commentary on the proposed funding for the National Endowment of the Arts and the National Endowment in the Humanities characterized that as a wealth transfer from the poor to the rich. Think about that. So if supporting nonprofits is a wealth transfer from the poor to the rich, what are we doing here? In this climate, we have to think about being different. And in fact, museums are starting to do completely non-traditional things in response to the way their audiences want to engage with them and enjoy their content. At the top here, you're seeing an event at the Santa Cruz Museum of Art and History called Glow. And yes, those are go-go dancers inside those little cages outside the museum. This is a small community-based museum that is asking, what do we need to do to really make a difference to our community? How do we make ourselves a convivial gathering place where people want to come to enjoy art and history? Who can we collaborate with in the community that will make us lively, vivacious, and the place to be on a Friday night? I hope your eyes were all drawn to this gentleman at the bottom who, yes, he really is only wearing a bikini bottom, and yes, he is oiled up. And what you can't see is he has also got temporary tattoos. This is a alternate reality game that was run at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. He is covered with clues as part of the game. And this game both played out nationally and internationally online and physically at the museum to get people searching inside the museum for art, for clues in the art, to create their own art that they sent into the museum, to contribute to an exhibit that accompanied the game, engaging audiences in new ways. Makerspace, hackerspace. People now want to do, not just view. They don't want to just look at great art, they want to do art themselves. How can museums accommodate that? By creating spaces where people can engage in their own creativity as well as appreciating that of others. It's a changing world. And in response to that, in part, they are morphing so much, we're beginning to have an identity crisis. We're beginning to blur the boundaries, even within that hugely diverse definition I already gave you of what is and what isn't a museum. This is Project Row Houses in Houston. It is a series of row houses that were converted in a very poor neighborhood to serve all sorts of neighborhood functions. Basically, Project Row Houses says, what do we need to help create a vital, healthy community? And that includes everything from housing unwed mothers, to providing daycare, to providing job training, to having a laundromat, because people have to have a place to wash their clothes. And yes, an integral part of that is having art galleries, because art is an important part of people's lives. And that's right in there with the daycare and the laundromat. Is that a museum? Well, it displays art. The Digital Diaspora Family Reunion. This is a grassroots, ground-up movement that is basically assembling an online archive of African American family history. It's a project that moves around the country, sets up shop, invites individuals from the African American community to bring photographs and documents from their family, sit down and record their stories for a microphone, scan the documents into a digital archive, sort of like StoryCorps meets Antiques Roadshow. And voila, what do you have? You have essentially an online museum, grounded in physical objects that museum neither owns or controls, but bringing together intellectual content that is tremendously important. And you have traditional museums. I'm not even going to try and pronounce that, you can read it. In Amsterdam, for example, this museum that has a huge collection of historic photographs is delivering that digital data through augmented reality applications to people's cell phones. So people can go around Amsterdam seeing, at this intersection, what did this look like 50 years ago? What did it look like 75 years ago? Well, that's a fabulous augmentation to the museum. What happens if the museum went away? What if it closed? What if its galleries weren't open? Would this still be a museum? Would the function of getting that digital data out into people's hands to interpret art and history still constitute being a museum? So we are a field that is deep in an exploration of how we adapt to this changing world, these rapidly accelerating trends, and to deep fundamental questions to our identity.
Thank you. Gigi.
Hello, everyone. Is this on? No. Hello? Okay,
I'll just pass the mic.
that's great. Hello? Okay. All right, well, I'll just go from here. Well, hello, everyone. I come from yet another field. So you've heard from museums. I come from the arts education field and from the creative learning field. And I work at an organization called Big Thought. And we have a systems mission. And our mission is to make imagination a part of everyday learning. And so we work with over 200 nonprofits. Certainly our symphony is one of those. Arts and cultural, youth development, education, public and private sector partners to make sure that every child in our city, in school and in out of school time, have an opportunity to explore, create, imagine, and study the arts. We do that through a program called Thriving Minds. And Thriving Minds is this very large partnership which we manage with our school district, our city, libraries, rec centers, all of that. We have managed in the last 4 or 5 years as our community has come together in this collaborative effort to put the arts back in our public schools. We're one of the few urban school districts in the country that has music, visual art as minimum standards of instruction for every child with certified teachers in the classroom across our whole urban system. But more than that, we also provide arts integration in every one of our elementary schools with 6,000 general classroom teachers provided in partnership with the cultural community. And we provide summer learning loss programs and after-school programs in hundreds of sites in our city in out-of-school time. And we've been able to accomplish this by changing the way we think about the role or the frame, the value proposition of arts education beyond visual literacy or understanding great music as the outcome to more broadly valued civic outcomes like successful students and vibrant communities and strong families. And so that's one of the ways that we've done that, is to think a little bit differently about it. I'm going to actually stop there and just hand it over. I have a lot more to say, but we'll do it in our conversation. Sorry. Oh, you know what? This is, well, I was going to say it might force us to get up out of our chairs, but I guess not. Okay. Yeah, we wish.
So my name is Dalouge Smith, and I'm the president and CEO of San Diego Youth Symphony Conservatory. We're a 66-year-old youth orchestra program that for the first 65 years was consistent with the tradition of youth orchestras in the United States, in that we primarily were providing an opportunity for students from across our local region to come together and perform alongside other highly dedicated and talented students in orchestral and wind programs. The youth orchestras, many started as a single youth orchestra, and like ours, as music began to diminish in school settings, we began to fill a gap by offering more programs at more levels. So we have a program that grew to 6 orchestras, 4 wind ensembles, et cetera, and 650 students. That group meets all those students for whichever group they're in. They meet every Saturday, and once a week is basically the musical encounter that we have with them. Our board of directors was our organization, with the drive of our board of directors, was selected to be in a program that the League of American Orchestras offered called the Institutional Vision Program, and it allowed us to start to create a vision for our role in our community. And the program was built around the Jim Collins framework of good to great. So these were the outcomes of our preliminary year of work in terms of self-articulating who we are, what was our core purpose, what were our core goal, our core values, and our long-term goal. In that context, he calls it a BHAG. My board hated that term, so we just called it a 10-year goal. But as you can see, our goal is to make music education accessible and affordable for all. Well, San Diego County has 500,000 school-age children. We're serving 650. And at the time we did this work, we were serving about 500. So the leap from 500 to 500,000 is pretty immense. And really the only way we could conceive of reaching that goal was to change the systems in our community, not just to become a program provider for 500,000 students. When we started to look at the community, what was happening in the community, we looked at these various factors. We also looked internally, and we looked to see who are we currently serving. And what we did is we took, this is like, now I know this is very elementary, but apparently it was very effective. We took online census data, we overlaid that with the county supervisorial districts, and we overlaid that with our own student household locations. And we came up with these percentages. And you can see we've got 5 districts in the San Diego region. 2 of them are large rural districts. 3 of them are the coastal urban or small town districts. This actually shows you a little more clearly what the percentage of students was as it related to local income. And you can see that the 2 largest pie slices in the pie, accounting for well over 50%, were the 2 wealthiest median income household regions of the county. And in fact, when we look at the city of San Diego itself, it's even more stark. You can see those 2 really high columns, the 76,000, 71,000 in income. And between those 2, our students that live in the city of San Diego, 75% of them were from that community. This shocked our board of directors. They thought we were the San Diego Youth Symphony, that we were serving the community as a whole. And they were not pleased to discover that our programs were designed in such a way that they really were serving the most affluent students, and at the expense of the non-affluent students. So then that's where we started to try to figure out, why is that? What's the situation? And the outcome of that was to change the way we thought about our programs and change the way we thought about our relationships with the schools and the school districts. We actually came to understand that even though some of our communities had music in the schools, the ecosystem of that music was not as strong underneath as it looked on the surface. And the location in the county that is the lowest income area of the county, which is near the border with Mexico, has a very high immigrant population. That particular area of the county has had and continues to have music in the middle school and the high school level. But the elementary music had diminished to such a degree that students were not beginning on their instruments until the 7th grade when they entered middle school. So we took that as and that was also happened to be the area of the county where we were serving the least number of students. So we took that as the first point of departure for our new kind of work in building community support for the restoration and the strengthening of music education in the schools. And we started by working in 2 school sites. We had an expectation that, okay, in this economic climate, it's going to take 3 to 5 years for the school district to see the light and find that what we're offering and what music offers, not what we're offering, but what music offers actually is adding to the goals that they have. The success of our program has been so substantial that a year and a half after we started our first program, we actually now are not at 2 schools, we're at 6 schools with dollars from the school district. The school district is planning to restore music to the 3rd grade next year during the school day, with the intention of building that out over multiple years to multiple grades and multiple schools. We were invited, because we were wanting to be in the community, we've now also been invited to pilot projects, music education projects, as part of a federal grant that it turns out is really hard to get, and we are very lucky to be included in this project. And in fact, a situation like that gives us a chance to do some experimentation that we had not even imagined. So the project we're going to run for the grant, the first part of the project, is a kindergarten music class, and it will be for all of the kindergartners at the target school, and the music class will be at the very end of their school day. Of course, we're going to look to having these children learn music, but the other primary goal is to get the parents engaged in their child's school experience at the kindergarten level. So we're putting the class at the very end of the school day so that instead of arriving at the campus at 1:50 to do the pickup, they can arrive at 1 o'clock, bring their siblings, be part of the music making, and then the family can go home together at that point. So we're thinking about how is it that what we're doing is going to have a bigger impact than just the instructional side of the program. Did this come on yet? Oh, it did.
Oh, it's on. Great. Just in time, too, for our conversation. So, Dalouge, you just described when you showed the maps and what you came to know about who was being served by your organization, you described a process that your organization went that led you to the conclusion something's got to change. And Elizabeth, you talked about some of the environmental changes, your first few points about the big environmental changes that are changing the way we have to operate as organizations. What are some other signals that, whether it's about your programs or the things that are happening outside of your programs, that organizations should be looking for, that it's time to rethink how you're connecting, and it's time to rethink how to get more systemic?
Well, I'll actually, let us see. So, this picture is a picture of the 1932 Tour de France. And what you're looking at here is the lead cyclist being assisted by his teammate in lighting his cigarette. And so I think sometimes we don't hear the messages from the edge. I mean, today we're laughing about this, right? But I think that there are things that we know now about how arts and culture and how it's valued in our communities, how we frame it, and how we think about it, that might lead us to believe that if we don't make some changes in the next 10 to 15 years, we may find ourselves in some dire straits. And I think it's, maybe true of symphonies. I'm not a symphony person, but I think I see that in my partners. And it isn't just symphonies, it's museums, it's all kinds of arts and cultural organizations. And the same thing is happening in education, right? I mean, we're having a huge conversation nationally about what are we going to do about the quality of our education and our youth. So I think that there are times, what I call messages from the edge, that help us see that it's time to make a change. So one of them is knowing that you could be part of a conversation and add real value, as you've talked about, say, to getting parents involved in schools. And so you see these conversations, these big conversations going on in the community, and the arts are not at the table as a solution. I think that is a message that the level of marginalization and the understanding about the value of what we offer our communities is not understood. And to me, that's a very big message that says it's time for something to change about the way we are talking about ourselves and the way we are behaving. I think finances are another good message from the edge. It's not the only thing, but if we're constantly struggling just to maintain the work that we're doing now, and we can't, no matter how much we twist ourselves around, and we can't seem to get over that hump of always being under-resourced, that I think is a message that something isn't sustainable about the work that we're doing. And I think that when we look at the people who engage in our organization, if it doesn't reflect our community and the community that we are working in, I think that's a pretty big sign that it's time to think about things in a new and different way. But one of the big ways to do that, that I think is important, is for us to quit sort of just talking to ourselves. and really know what we're doing. I think we make assumptions. I think big organizations often do, or systems do, make assumptions about what they know or what they value and what they're not willing to release about the work that they're doing in order to change, in order to figure out what the next thing is that needs to be done. We had a similar experience here. 10 years ago, the organization that I run had a different name. And we were seeing these signs of marginalization and not being able to grow anymore or innovate in the ways we wanted to, not having the resources or the support. And we went out in the community and began to talk about what is it that you value about what we do, arts education, arts and culture, imagination, what is it that you think is valuable, our stakeholders. And what we heard was stunning to us, like your board with the numbers. We had a similar sort of thing. We found that the word art and arts education to parents, teachers, city officials was really fluffy, or they didn't understand it, or they had a negative response to it, or they thought it was paintings that you hung on the wall, and they thought that's what we were talking about, not institutions. But when we started talking about creativity and imagination and innovation and knowing your history and connecting to your culture and to other people's cultures, all of a sudden we got huge noddings of heads and understanding. So we changed the name of our organization, and we changed the frame that we worked in. We made a bigger tent, a tent that was big enough for the symphony and the museum and the opera, but also big enough for community-based arts organizations and arts and culture and youth development and education to come under and to de-silo. That made us powerful. And it was a big change in our logic about the way we thought about what we were doing. We also used data. I'm going to take my time now since I didn't end the thing, and then I'll be quiet. We also took a look at data. So one of the things we did as a community was we looked at if you looked at the aggregate numbers of what all the community organizations were doing in this city, you would have thought that we were serving hundreds and hundreds of thousands of children. But we looked a little deeper, and it wasn't very sophisticated. Again, it was fairly simple, like what you did. And we took a look at who was going where, and when we looked underneath those numbers just a little bit, we found that we were all serving the same 25,000 children over and over and over and over again. And that those kids lived in the northern part of the city, in the more affluent neighborhoods of our city. So we actually had a system that ghettoized and had real systemic barriers to the children in our community having access to our city's cultural assets. And once that was made visible to our school board and our city, which are funding, putting tax dollars into these institutions, that became untenable. So it was that combination of changing the way the system, the political system, saw what they were funding and how they were funding, that was the impulse, the catalyst for us to make a change. And the process of doing that, am I going the wrong way? No, I'm doing good. Okay, great. So the process of doing that and getting those big messages from the edge, we're not serving the kids we thought we were serving. We're not drawing in the people or the support that we feel we should be getting. And we're perhaps not talking about ourselves in the compelling ways and with the value propositions that reflect our community. I think those are big parts of getting, I should have had a V8 moment when you go, we got to quit doing what we're doing and literally think about this in a completely different way.
So this is an interesting question. You brought it up earlier and asked us to think about it. How is it you know when it's time to change? And I'm going to presume it's not the easy answer when you're going broke, because then you already know. The question is, how do you know there's a signal of something when you still look healthy? And that's a really good question. And I have two answers. One is when you realize that things are shifting out from under you. So you're fine now, but all the things that are making you fine, if you look closely, those are not going in the same direction. A very simple example is the age of your supporters. I've talked to a historic house recently where the director looked at me and said, you know what? Our attendance is fine, our income is fine, The average age of our board members, volunteers, and people who come to our programs, the average age is 65.
Wow.
That model is only sustainable if you assume that people who are 35, 45, 55 are going to suddenly magically turn into supporters of that museum when they turn 60 or 65. And the fact is, there's no reason to believe that's true. What we're looking at is the boomer generation aging into those cohorts. And the boomers never acted like their parents. And they're not going to act like their grandparents. There's no reason to assume with any safety that they're suddenly going to behave the way that their elders do when they hit that mark. So you better not be comfortable with the way you're operating now if the age demographics of your audience are that skewed. And you can play that out in all of the categories I was talking about: social, technological, economic, political. If circumstances are changing, even if you're fine now, don't feel comfortable. The second indicator, I think, that would suggest you need to change, even if things seem healthy now, is when you start throwing resources at trying to make something better, and you try really hard, you spend a lot of time and money on it, and you only get this much better. Yep. That suspects you're at the top of the curve of what you're doing. You're already doing it really, really, really well. I'm sorry, you can throw a ton more resources at it, and it's only going to get incrementally better. You've maxed out the possibility of that model. Now, if you're comfortable with that, maybe it's okay, but again, the changing circumstances are probably going to mean at some point that model broke. But if you're at a point where you're already doing what you do so well that even a massive influx of resources only makes it incrementally better, it tells you where on that developmental curve you are. You're right at the top of the asymptotic curve, and you'd better be ready to fall to the bottom and revolutionize again because you've maxed out your model.
They've done a great job.
Good. Thank you. And Gigi, you mentioned when you were talking about the language change, the change in language, and in your case, the change of name of the organization and actually expanding to involve completely new and different partners. How do you find out what the community values are? It's about getting outside of our own art-specific or orchestra-specific context and becoming more relevant, even just in the way we talk to our communities and engage in our introductory conversations on what more or different should we be doing. How do you get to a better understanding of what's the language that resonates, where are they that we need to meet them, and who the essential partners are in doing that?
Oh, I think you have to actually quit talking to ourselves and our own patrons, and we have to go have conversations with the people we're trying to engage. And we do that through focus groups and through surveys and through pizza, lots of pizza and sandwiches in community centers. We go into the community and we have really pretty structured conversations where we have questions that we're trying to find answers to. But I think the hubris of thinking we have the answers to those questions inside our little world is really one of the things that keeps us stuck. And I have actually a couple of slides and we call it dominant logic. So we think we know something, whatever it is, whatever problem we're trying to solve. And we find that when we go out in the community, we actually test what we think we know, we find out almost always that it wasn't what we thought it was. That in fact, we didn't know that it was something totally different. And I'll give you an example. One was when we went out and we talked about education. And I think we thought that education was something that started at 8 o'clock in the morning and ended at 3:30 in the afternoon in buildings called schools. And the more that we went out and observed and talked to and looked at how education was actually happening at a kid and a family level, we found out kids learn all day long. And teachers can be lots of different people. They aren't just certain people with degrees. That there's very effective teaching and learning going on in our community, and particularly in the arts. There is a lot of effective, good, high-quality arts learning that's going on, not in schools necessarily. So that is a really big shift in our logic, because if our reality check is that the way to do quality arts education, the only way to do it, is the way we've been thinking about it, then that limits a lot of our options in how to solve the problem of getting it to every kid. But if in fact we can think about it with a different logical framework, we might find that there's a lot of very powerful learning going on in lots of different places. And in fact, that is what we found. Another one that was really startling was this one. We call it salsa in the cafeteria. So we thought community engagement was about changing our repertoire or doing our programs bilingually or doing those sort of things that really are not, that are really just, come on everybody, we're going to learn about Mexico by having salsa in the cafeteria, right? So that's not really community engagement. We found out community engagement was about understanding what people valued in that community about the art forms that were real in those communities, and starting there and then taking people to how it connects to all the other things that are of value. So those things we found out by literally going out and talking with very specific questions about, you know, how do you think about engaging in arts and arts learning, and how do you value it? So I think you have to go out, you have to talk, you have to try. So we would actually design something. We'd go back to that same group of people and go, okay, we listened to you, and this is what we thought might work. What do you think now? And then we'd find out what part of it we got right and what part of it we didn't, and then we go back and redesign it. And it's really a circle of conversations like that that we just have constantly. We're totally always trying to make it more relevant, more impactful, and more real in the field. And we can't do that by just talking to ourselves, because we aren't them. I mean, we aren't that.
So when you're talking about messages from the edge are people who are so distant from the work we're doing now that we're not hearing them in the work that we're doing.
That's right. We think we're the thing because we're the experts and we know what people need and we know our content and we have our dominant logic. And our dominant logic is the springboard. It's like jazz, right? I mean, you got to have you have to have the real stuff before you can go off. But if you have the real stuff and you don't go off, it's not the thing. It's not real. And so I think but we have to listen to the edge. We can't just find our solutions at the core. If we had the solutions, those people from the edge would already be engaged in our work.
So just a quick follow-up question, because aside from pizza, and I also heard you say an important part is letting them know that you're listening to them by going back and retesting your conclusions.
Yep. Again and again.
And so what's the entry point? What's the thing that you do that gains their trust to have the conversation in the first place? If they've been marginalized or at the edge in terms of interacting with your programs, and for anyone to answer, what are some things you can do to make it the right atmosphere for that?
I'm going to say just real quick, and then I want to turn it over to my colleagues, two very important things we learned about making mistakes. One is, don't invite them to come see you. Go see them. Find out where they are and where they go to churches, go to community centers, go to the community, in the community, and have the conversation. And when you do it, send a spokesperson that can have that conversation with that community. So it's also, who is your messenger? Who is sending out and asking those questions? And that's very, very important, because you want to send people who do speak the language, who do understand the culture of the community that you're talking with, who can have that conversation and break down the barriers that are cultural or language or socioeconomic, whatever those barriers are, to having a real exchange of ideas.
Your turn.
I wanted to, I feel like we're repeating each other's words up here. It's very exciting to think, okay, we're at the very beginning of our work, and the practice that we've undertaken is so similar to what I'm hearing Gigi say after her 10 years plus of work on this. I want to articulate what you just said slightly differently, which is to say, you get connected to the community and you actually build credibility in the community through identifying your allies in the community. In all likelihood, the community that you are seeking to work with and seeking to contribute to is also undergoing change, stress, and a kind of dynamic tension itself. So there are going to be people in that community that are, like you, seeking new resource and new opportunity outside of itself, but there will also be people in that community that's trying to maintain its insular nature or its status quo. So finding those bridge people is critical, and usually they're going to be someone who's going to be a great preliminary sounding board for you, so that as you're learning from them and letting them in on whatever it is that you're suggesting is a possible offering to their community, they're going to tell you if it's of meaning or not of meaning. In our particular case, I'll give an example. We started by being introduced to the school district partners through a social service partner, and we actually asked them, what are the right instruments to suggest for instruction? And the answer came back, string instruments, because in our Latino culture, we have string instruments. So there's going to be a degree of familiarity for our families and for our community. Interestingly enough, now 2 years later, I had a parent say that when her child came home and said he wanted to play cello, cello was not viewed as part of that community. And there was a real confusion as to, why would my child want to play cello? Subsequently, they have now actually come to see how much classical music surrounds them, and so they do feel a deeper connection to it. But we never maybe would have even thought that strings were the right way to go had we not gotten that suggestion. The other thing to remember is what you believe you are delivering, or what you believe is the benefit you're bringing, may not be the benefit that they are seeing. And in this case, I want to say we thought that our greatest delivery service was going to be helping these school districts see, or the justification that they were going to want to use for restoring music to school was test scores, attendance. We thought it's all going to be connected to the dollars. Interestingly enough, the thing that the assistant superintendent speaks to me about the most is parent engagement. The thing that the principals speak to us the most about is student behavior. So those test scores and those attendance issues actually are getting resolved through another filter that we weren't even thinking about. And that had to do with sort of the basic human interactions. So it's really important to be, again, not just listening, but dynamically listening and identifying. So we would never have thought that this notion of a kindergarten music program to engage parents would have been something to suggest until we'd gotten through our first year and we were hearing over and over how strongly the music was affecting parent engagement and how positively that was being viewed. So when we suggested that to a principal who had never worked with us before, first time we sat down with her, she really wondered what we were doing there. And we said, we think we've got an idea to help you engage these parents. She was absolutely open to it because it was a problem she was already trying to solve, and we had some evidence that we could solve it. Had nothing to do with kindergarten test scores, and it probably never will.
Seriously important strategy is to find out what your value is to the people that you're trying to partner with, and let it be okay that, a lot of times you'll hear in the arts world, they'll go, well, that's not arts for art's sake. That's, kindergarten arts for parent engagement, and that somehow that makes the experience the kids are having in the arts less because it has this dual outcome. In fact, that doesn't have to be the case, and often it makes it stronger. In fact, that you have parent engagement, then your arts education goals are actually getting strengthened by pairing it with this other outcome. That's a shift in dominant logic that I'm talking about. It's saying, let it be okay that we don't all agree that the most important thing we're doing here is the same thing. The school thinks it's parent engagement, we think it's arts education. As long as both of those goals are being met, who cares, right? Really, ultimately, as long as we're able to provide the service to the kids and it's a high quality service. We have to let go of some of our sacred sort of ideas about ourselves in order to be able to make this shift.
So, okay, two different things. How do we know what the community wants? I can tell you what I tell museums, which is hire the people you're serving. Right now, 80% of museum studies graduate students are white, 80% of museum graduate students are female, and the vast majority are affluent, or else they couldn't afford to take on the debt they have to assume in order to get a museum studies degree. You're starting right there with a huge barrier in culture and communication that you have to then overcome. Why start there? running a museum isn't rocket science. Yes, if you need a curator of paleontology, you probably need somebody who has a degree in paleontology, and that's a very narrow pipeline. But at least in a museum, you have educators, you have frontline staff, you have people who are the community resource organizers, you have the volunteer coordinators. There's no reason that those people can't be hired from the community. And right there, you've got your pipeline to what people want, what they need, and you've got built-in credibility and lines of communication. Sure, it requires overturning assumptions. Sure, it requires educating people about who works in museums and why it might be a great job, which heaven knows isn't common knowledge. It's shaping people's behavior all over the country. That wasn't because they sat down with a focus group and had somebody say, you know what I want? I want to be able to have an app on my phone that tells me whether or not to eat this fish. It came from an awareness that a lot of the people they were reaching cared deeply about the environment, wanted to do something to make a difference, didn't have the information, so that there were endangered fish species that were being endangered by people's consumption habits. And they're the ones who made the leap then to say, we have this great thing we could do that people never would have thought of, but they'll be all over it if we produce it.
So in addition to having the right people in the institution that are reflective of the communities that you want to reach, what other things need to be in alignment institutionally to take on community needs in a systemic way, to think beyond a fiscal year, or to think beyond a particular funder's interest at a particular time? What else does the institution have to be prepared to do? What, cross-department collaboration seems like something that would be nice. What else?
You mean across the, inside the organization? That's an issue. But I think, and that is an issue, because when you're trying to push change in behavior, it's sometimes hardest to get it happening inside your organization. But I still think it has to do with how you align externally as well. So I think that it is about having an openness to taking on a different role. And a really good example is, we were an organization that identified, trained, and sent artists and musicians into schools to perform and share what they did and to bring kids into performances. So that was mostly a programmatic function. But in order to work at a systems level, we had to get good at research and evaluation. We had to get good at massive coordination of many agencies and programs. We had to get good at advocacy and policy. So there were whole capacities or competencies inside the organization that to make the shift, we had to start putting money, resources, and hiring different kinds of people. And having, again, those different kinds of conversations. I mean, a focus group to ask, what do you want, or what would be meaningful to you, is not a helpful focus group. The focus group, and we had to have people who knew how to have these conversations. The focus group conversation is, what are your aspirations for your children? What do you value? And it isn't, I want my kids to learn more about Spanish composers and music. I want my child to assimilate into American culture and be more successful than I am. That's what our immigrant parents value and want more than anything. They're willing to sacrifice almost anything for it. That's why they're here. So to what extent does engaging in these programs meet that? And then how do you align to do that, to change the system to make that possible, to break down the barriers of access or whatever those barriers are? And they can tell you what those barriers are to that, what they perceive them to be.
I think that you have to be ruthlessly honest with yourself as an institution. You have to know who you are and what you're capable of doing, what you're not capable of doing.
So they basically got around these existing silos and barriers, not by trying to build bridges, but by getting rid of them, by saying we're going to change the way that we're organized so profoundly people can't fall back into their comfort zones. Now, I offer this as an extreme example, not because everybody can do it, but because it demonstrates that sometimes the best thing to do is to really overshoot. It's not to do just as much as you have to do to change the system, because if you go this far, it's going to be 2 steps forward and 1 step back. It's going to be going 5 steps forward, going way past people's comfort level, because once you change the game enough that they can't fall back to what they're used to doing, even when they take those 2 steps back, it's going to be in a different place.
With our remaining time, I wanted to provide you the opportunity to ask some questions of our panel as well. So are there any questions that you'd like to address to this gang? Yes.
Gigi, you mentioned how learning happens all the time, and I think in museums we talk about informal learning, informal environments. And this is my first time to this conference, and I've heard many orchestras talk about wonderful programs they're doing in schools and going into schools and lots of collaborations. But I think there's a potential for orchestras themselves to become effective learning environments, not because they already have wonderful venues and the building. And I was wondering, maybe Dalouge can speak to this too, if in addition to going to schools, but within the orchestras and with the resources we already have, what orchestras can do to become more effective learning environments, informal learning environments.
You
start.
probably should start on that.
Should I?
Yeah.
Did everyone hear the question? So the question was beyond what's most commonly talked about in orchestra education efforts, which is going out in the community, out into schools. And this is a great question. So when I think of museums and how we would hope to emulate them in certain ways, I wonder about this too. The question is, how can orchestras in their halls be seen as places of learning, right? More systemically be seen as places of learning.
You have an answer.
I'll just say that I think that the experience of opening up the experience, and we've seen some pretty great examples of that in our education programs, but also in the education programs that we see in our symphony and symphonies around the country. But also even the experience of attending a performance and opening that experience up so that you could have an opportunity to see behind what we call the fourth wall. How does it really get put together? How does a conductor and unveiling the mystery of the inside of the working of how this music is created and the people who create it. So again, it's about connecting with the people and doing that in ways that include pre-performance. I mean, you all do all of this, but it's more the content and the experience of how that's done. At the same time, I have to say that part of the dominant logic that keeps us, and Dallas is a very good example of this. We have built some magnificent buildings fairly recently in the city to do this. And sometimes we think the buildings and the place is the important thing and what happens in that building. When what we're seeing is that our cultural institutions that are most sustainable and most successful are those that find ways to make their building happen in other places, so that it's not always just the building. Let me give you a really good example of that. For instance, and this one's going to be in a museum, happens to be a museum example. Our museum had a great exhibit that they were putting together that was an artist that did these exquisite shadow boxes that were very personal reflections of events in the artist's life and things that had happened. And so what our museum did was they partnered through Thriving Minds, through this work that we're doing, and they literally built these in libraries. They did neighborhood shadow boxes where people from the neighborhood brought items from their home that meant things to them and deposited them in these huge open things that you could see. They were clear and you could see them. And then once these were being collected all month long, then over the course of 2 weeks, people could come in and use these items to create visual stories of what happens in that community, in that neighborhood. And they were poignant, and they were real, and they were authentic, and they were very, very powerful. And they drove people from these neighborhoods into the library then to experience the arts. Those are the kinds of very deep educational and informal learning experiences that institutions that are place-based can make happen in the community, that can be really powerful because they're personal and they're happening in a neighborhood, in a family context, and that's very sticky and meaningful to people.
So first I want to clarify, I do not manage a building, so I'm I'm fortunate enough that I don't have to think about this very often. However, I would say this: I go to a lot of cultural events. I'm in the arts because I grew up in the arts, and my mom is a professional artist as well. So I'm steeped in the tradition of going to a venue at a certain time of day or evening, sitting still for the presentation of the experience and having my program book to read through or some other introductory talk. And I came to this work came to this sort of community work by design, but never got where I thought I was going, in the sense that I wanted to put theaters in malls, and I thought, wow, there really needs to be a way for people to be where they are in their everyday life and have these kinds of experiences. And actually, I now think that would have been a bad idea. Because in my mind, I was still conceiving of the theater experience as I had grown up to appreciate it, which was you sit down and you watch a show at a specific time of day, and you'd have to have actors that were there performing at those times of day. But I think that we in the performing arts in particular have not done a great job of reconceiving our physical spaces beyond the specialized purpose for which they were built. And in fact, I've begun to wonder about what is the obsolescence of a concert hall? When does a concert hall actually stop serving its community, not because it's not great still for concerts, but because there's more that should be done with it. There's more experience that should be had in the concert hall, and the way the concert halls are built today, or professional theater settings, or opera halls, or similar venues, are they actually well designed for multiple purposes? Even if you've got the core central space of a performance space, which you really want to have to be perfect for its use. Walt Disney Concert Hall actually has a permanent exhibit space, so there is a kind of rotating exhibit space in the hall. The hall itself is its own architectural landmark, and so there are tours of the hall. There's a lot and unfortunately, because of the times we live in, you can't go through Walt Disney Concert Hall without being on a tour or being there for a concert. They actually guard it quite strictly. But there are some examples in that are about the hall as more than a performance space. And I think that's the question. Anne has a question.
While you were talking about the metaphor of boulders, I was actually thinking about the metaphor of Christmas or of a holiday. And when you think about some of this, it's almost like, what if you were starting Christmas from scratch?
Exactly.
Right? So there are certain things that everybody assumes happens, and there are certain things that in your own household are really important to you, but they might not be the same as everybody else. So I'm curious, I have a two-part question that's sort of related, of what do you do to help facilitate with your own staff and in these conversations about organizing the conversations, that you're honoring what's happening in each household and what's happening at the Uber state at the same time? And related to that, the word time is something that doesn't change. So we all have 24 hours in a day. And I'm curious how you each personally use your time to planning, to working these things out with staff, because that's, I think, the back end of creating all of this is a lot of thoughtful
Yeah,
intention.
it's true. Yeah. It's two different questions.
Yeah, so the time thing is the one that I'm really curious about, but
Go ahead.
either one, whichever you guys want to talk about.
I'll answer the time question, since I think in boulders and you think in Christmas. The time question, I have had to spend a lot of time on planning, and in a sense on, it's almost like being a herd dog, having to continuously circle my community and make sure that we're all going in the same direction. And the, you know, that takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of energy, both. I'm not sure, what I'm finding now is for our organization, we're at the stage where what was a good idea has now become an immense amount of work and has accelerated at a speed far beyond anything we ever imagined. So I'm finding that the way that I use my time actually has to change pretty radically, and the way I use my board's time has to change pretty radically. In a lot of respects, we've been able to really fine-tune what we're doing and be meticulous about it. And now we have to maintain that attention to detail, but we're going to have to be able to do it at a higher speed, and we're going to have to be able to do it at a kind of more robust volume. So the way that I end up using my time, if I was to cut it into percentages, it has been probably 40 to 50% has been the kind of the planning and the step-by-step process, and then the other 50% has been all of the other responsibilities I have, whether that's fundraising or board management or hiring or whatever those things might be. But I think it's now going to shift. I think the fundraising piece is going to take over a lot more, and I'm going to have to delegate out some of the fine-tuning to more staff, because ideally they now have it in the same depth I do, but also because in order for me to have the staff to do the work we're going to do, it's going to take a lot more resource than we've ever had. We potentially could double our budget in 3 years. This kind of work has grown so fast.
So I have a somewhat different question about time. Moving a boulder takes time. Making real change happen at the community level takes time. We are organizations that don't measure our success in terms of, unfortunately, how will things look 20 years from now, but what happened in the course of 12 months or what happened even in the course of a quarter. So how do you handle the measuring success or reporting it out or being accountable for change when the process itself takes a long time to accomplish?
So I just want to say, we chose to measure our success in a 10-year increment. And that's ultimately a choice everybody can make. And that's what Jim Collins says in Good to Great, that the transformative companies, whether they're for-profit or nonprofit, are those companies that looked so far out on the horizon and maintained their fixed pursuit of that point on the horizon that they actually achieved change far beyond any of their other colleagues or compatriots. So if you aren't thinking in the long term, then you're really probably not doing yourself full service, because there's so much more that can be achieved that way.
Okay, so I'm just going to say actually ditto to that. I think we've been doing this same work, making imagination a part of everyday learning, for 25 years, this organization has. And we do look, we measure longitudinally, we set expectations in our community over 5 and 10 year sort of increments. Now, we have 12-month goals, and we have benchmarks along the way to that, but to see the long term, I think you really have to have, we have these are really big boulders, if you will, or whatever. My metaphor is a train, and you used what great one at breakfast, Elizabeth, where you said it's like re-engineering the plane in flight. And I think that's a really strong image, too, to think about what it is that you're doing. You are what you are. You're trying to change the direction of it or move it in another direction. You're still what you are, but you're trying to become something else, and you're moving at the same time that you're doing it. So, looking at time a long way from it, we're about to go through a 5-year. We're doing a lot of conversations. We've accomplished a lot in the last 5 years, and we're looking at what are the next 10 years going to look like, and what is the next 5 horizon for us, and more importantly, what are the things we have to start doing so that we can keep our eye on the horizon and know whether we're getting lost at sea or not, or we're moving towards those goals. And I think in terms of how you spend your time, if what you're doing is trying to change the dominant logic or make a shift or do big change that isn't incremental, that's literally a new way of thinking about or doing something, if you are the leader, leader, you are going to spend a tremendous amount of your time communicating the change and bringing people along a change that's like a comet. You're at the front of the comet or you're conductor of the train. You've got to go back and pick people up. And I tell the same stories over and over again. I repeat myself constantly. It depends on who I'm talking to and at what level they joined the train. I've got to keep people up to speed and keep people moving in the same direction. So I like your herd dog. That's a good one too. But I think so it doesn't matter. If I'm raising money, I'm still communicating where we are in the vision. If I'm talking to my staff, if we're planning, really what I do is the same thing all the time, and it's getting people focused on the goal, on what it is that we're trying to make happen.
Any final thoughts?
I would just encourage you to think as hard about not using the wrong measures as you do about picking the right ones, because I agree with you that the most meaningful measures are very long-term, but the temptation is you have to have something in the short term, so what will we measure? Ooh, attendance. Everybody can measure attendance. But you get what you measure, and if you fixate on the wrong short-term measures, then it tends to take you in the wrong direction, and you never get to the correct long-term ones. And at least for museums, I really think it is long-term. You ask a mom what she wants from a children's museum, short-term, she'll tell you hands-on experiences. You ask adults what they remember as kids, it's having a transformative experience, seeing a dinosaur or staring at a painting or being inside a historic house. They don't remember the hands-on experiences. So if all you aimed at was making mom happy today and being able to measure that, you may have missed the opportunity to change a child's life.
And I just want to add one thing about the comet. We had our sort of 5-year plan. We burned through it in a year and a half. So you have to be careful. So the kind of the consequence of that is that we are about to redo a whole new bunch of work that we thought we had behind us, at least for a little while, and be dynamic to that process. So the kind of how you spend your time over the long term is equally as fluid as in the short term.
Be flexible.
Very good. Well, thank you very much.
I just wanted to end with an offer. I have a lot of the forecasting material produced by AAM through the center I think is applicable across the cultural field. If you'd like to come up and get a card from me so you could access our resources, I have a few copies of our last forecasting report if you'd like a copy, or I can tell you where to get it online. I'll stick around afterwards.
Great. Will you join me in thanking our panel?